Hey, what's up guys, welcome to the channel and to another Reddit encounters video. And today I've got for you a few Skinwalker and maybe other creatures encounters. So get yourself nice and cozy and let's get into them already. Enjoy.
Personal Skinwalker story from 2017, submitted by Yunjiro.
First time poster on this sub. I've been holding on to this story for a number of years since every so often there's a good time to tell it, and I felt that I should finally post it here to get people's thoughts on it. I'd like to apologize in advance as I'd like to think I'm a decent storyteller in person, but pretty lackluster, long-winded in text. Also, as I write about later, I try and use animal noises to describe some sounds. Take them all with a grain of salt, as I know that's not the exact thing I heard, but the closest sound I can relate it to or describe it with. I go between I and we a couple of times as described at the end. My friends and I all discussed what happened to confirm we all in fact heard the same thing and had the same experience. To preface the story and where it takes place, I grew up in the Huron region of Ontario. For those not familiar, it's about a 3-hour drive directly west from Toronto, where I live now, on the shore of Lake Huron, not far from the area of tales of the Black Donnellys are from for you dark history lovers. During my time in high school, there was one teacher who had talked about his experiences in a small forested place called Lob's Bush. Although I wasn't very familiar with it at the time, it was known by a fair number of locals as a very haunted place in the area or where people have had unexplainable but startlingly similar encounters. This teacher was very outspoken about his experiences in that bush, but also his steadfast trust in being a non-believer in the paranormal/supernatural, which in turn made him of all people the most fascinating to hear it from. Always ends his stories or answers question with, "I don't believe it, can't explain it, I'm just telling you what happened." A few years later, in the winter of 2017, both after having him as my teacher in high school and having since moved away to attend my first year of university, I came back to my hometown for my winter break to spend some time with family and catch up with my friend group. For anyone familiar with the small town experience, our favorite activity was the age-old classic of buying a terrible number of cheap reservation cigarettes, hoping in one of our friends' terribly run-down beater cars, and then smoking, chatting, and playing the worst music ever conceived until either the smokes or the gas tank run out. We were all hovering around 16, 18, so this was just the most fun, general things we could do. On top of finally having a break from all of my uni coursework, this was the first time seeing these friends in a couple of months, so we were all excited to be one big group again. I won't bore you with all the earlier antics of the evening, but where this story picks up is after driving around, catching up for a few hours, we pit stop at a random bush trail so some of us could smoke some weed. As we started walking down one of the trails, I remember feeling a very stark change in the atmosphere around us. I didn't really want to express my feelings to ruin the mood, but I definitely felt the need to be on high alert. I've never really had a way to describe the physical feeling apart from my chest feeling heavy, but somehow it was very clear that something was watching us and did not want us there. Every few steps I needed to look back to make sure something wasn't stalking us. All we had were our phone flashlights, which had a very short distance. The way through the trail set in the bush, it was all new trees, so they curled over the path to almost form a tunnel. It looked as if we had walked into the maw of a massive creature slowly making our way down its throat. We only made it about a few hundred meters before realizing that the calm night was turning into a winter storm. We all agreed to go back to the car and would start making our way home before it got any worse. By the time we made it back to the car, the trees were swinging wildly in the wind and the snow made it hard to see the next couple of feet in front of us. Once we made it to the car, we started to drive back to the closest town so as to stay at a friend's place to wait out the storm. While driving, the weather continued getting worse until the snow had practically blinded us while going around the notable halfway there turn. We found out that our estimate of how far to turn the car wasn't enough and felt the car's momentum stall and slide sideways into the ditch. After a short period of us hurling claims of backseat driving and general frustrations, we ended up staying in the ditch for around 5 hours before being rescued by local police and driven the rest of the way into town. During our time in the ditch, I talked about how I felt while walking into the woods, and we all agreed with the feeling of knowing we shouldn't be there, and none of us spoke up until now. Only after that did our friend in the driver's seat, and the only one familiar with this particular back road, inform us that we were in fact walking through Lob's Bush. Fast forward some time to believe my second semester reading week, I'm back home with my friends and back to our same old acts. After a particularly good night of catching up, we decided to go revisit Lab's Bush as none of us had been there since getting caught in the ditch, and the weather was already warm this month with far less snow. I remember feeling almost excited to go back, rather than dark, impenetrable clouds and snow. Tonight the moon was out and barely needed flashlights to see where we were going. We parked the car in the same spot and grabbed all necessary smoking apparatus and a pack of smokes for the driver and me to share, as of course, neither time are we dumb enough to get our designated driver high. As we started walking into the trail, I started realizing landmarks that I had missed from my first time there. With the moonlight making everything more visible, I walked through the same threshold as before and was pleasantly surprised that I didn't feel like I was watched or unwelcome to walk through. After a point, I had almost forgotten that I was in the infamous woods and was enjoying a late night walk through the forest laughing with my friends. After walking further down the trail, we finally came to an opening. On the right side of the trail, the trees had parted out to showcase the edge of a field, nicely lit by the moonlight. On the left side, the bush clears out, so there is a lovely section of grass and light foliage parting to show a small stream cutting through. It looked like a naturally made auditorium with the stream cutting through like a main walkway, sparse trees so plenty of seating for an audience, and the trees opening and leading down to the farmer's field as the stage. In all honesty, I had completely forgotten we were there to smoke and was just enamored with how pretty it was. As we found a spot to stop and ready our lights to smoke, one friend had the bright idea to exclaim, "Yo, I forgot the Roman candle." As we all turned to look, they had already gotten their lighter out and was proceeding to light the candle. Again, we were late teens, we were idiots. She proceeds to point the candle towards the big clearing to the field, every once in a while moving it around so it is not shooting in the same spot. Going higher and higher into the air, she finally points it in the opposite direction towards the wood. With surprising accuracy, none of the shots actually hit anything before going out until one finally hits a tree near the stream and spirals into the woods, where we can't see it. Within no more than a second's time, this blood-curdling scream comes from the exact place the Roman candle bounced into the woods beyond our view. We all completely froze, unsure of what to make of it, as the scream continued on for a worrisome amount of time. I can only describe it as a cross between a deeper version of a howler monkey's roar and an ear-ringing whine like an elk's bugle going higher in pitch as it kept screaming. I remember my ears vibrating from how loud it was. I wanted to cover them, but we were all frozen in place from it. Finally, one of us snapped into reality and yelled, "Run!" and bolted off towards the farmer's field. We all in turn started running away from the ongoing scream from within the woods. As we were running, the scream finally stopped after about 10 seconds of constant noise. There was no breath or change in the scream apart from pitch. It was able to yell at that volume for longer than I've heard any animal do. Before we could even think, we heard a heavy rustling in the woods as whatever it was took a deep inhale to scream again. The inhale was just as terrifying, sounding like an alligator's bellow mixed with a hyena's laugh. I know both sounds I'm describing are from exhaling, but you could tell this wasn't a guttural, full-chested and preparatory inhale before screaming again. Unlike the first scream that almost sounding reactionary, surprised by the Roman candle almost hitting it, this was clearly an angry roar. Whatever it was really fucking big, with the lungs to prove it, and now moving towards us. It was even louder and what I could only assume was now pointed towards us. Even though we were all heavy smokers at the time, we all ran as fast as we possibly could without looking back, absolutely terrified from the second continuous roar that was now gaining on us. After about 15 seconds, the scream stopped abruptly. It took us a second to realize the noise was gone. We turned around to see that we'd made it out to the woods and onto the field. We only looked back briefly to see what we had put about 50 to 100 meters between us and the edge of the bush. Even before we could really think straight, we shakily agreed to make our way to the closest road and make our way back to the front of the bush to find where we parked. It was only once we got to the road and caught our smoked-out breath did one of us finally ask if we all heard and felt that. We all talked briefly, but we were too on edge to actually converse. About 20 minutes later, we finally made it back to the road and had the car in sight. We all started to calm down as we had some time to process and let the adrenaline wear off. We unlocked the car, all got into our respective seats with our bags. None of us had the time to take it off before the scream happened, As the driver finally turned the car on and the headlights flooded the woods in front of us, the front passenger just screamed, "Drive, drive, drive." The driver, without looking, cranked the car into reverse and turned around to back out quickly and go down the back road as fast as he could beside the bush. The friend who screamed started to freak out all over again. I was sitting directly behind him with my hands on his shoulder from the back seat. As we tried to ask what was wrong, I was looking over my shoulder to look into the woods. I genuinely felt like time had slowed down as I looked over, with the same feeling of something watching me like my first time in the woods. As the trees passed by, I could clearly make out two fully open eyes reflecting back at me. I could clearly make out two full reflective circles. I was completely frozen and couldn't look away. I couldn't tell if the eyes were locked on me or the whole vehicle, or even what light they were reflecting off of as we were driving besides the woods. They were clearly further back into the woods by a couple of meters, so I couldn't make out how tall it was. But I could very easily see they were attached to a head much larger and taller than a human. I completely forgot about comforting the passenger in front of me and instead tried to turn and see it for longer through the back window as we kept driving, but had completely lost the visual. I couldn't even make a sound, but my mind was racing. The longer I sat, the longer I wondered how the hell it got to where I could see it after we had sped away from the parking spot. I don't know how much it saw from the car, but I know it saw me. It saw all of us in those woods. I don't know how to describe it other than that I was fully prey, and whatever it was a predator that knows me now. After driving for a while on our way back to a friend's farm, we were all able to speak about what had happened. We all heard the same noises, heard the rustling, heard the same far too long screams, and finally the other passenger and I both agreed on seeing the same wide eyes staring at us. Neither of us got a good look at what it was, but both agreed that it was staring at us and was too big to make out. The passenger also made a comment that even though it was a couple of meters into the woods when he saw it, it had to be much bigger than a human. After a couple of hours more conversing about it, we all finally felt comfortable driving back to our respective homes. Every couple of months when we'd see each other, we'd make certain to each other that we all saw the same thing, as we wanted to make sure none of us were truly losing it mentally. I said the events of this story for about a year, not really sure who to tell or who would believe any of us for that matter. Once I finally felt comfortable talking and researching things similar, I came to the personal conclusion that it might be something along the lines of a skinwalker, and started looking further into stories about it. As there was so much talk of people having similar encounters or strange happenings in Lob's bush, I really wanted to entertain and research any and all of possibilities. On top of that, although raised somewhat Christian in school, it was never a dogma I really followed or was having to the idea of other powers until this happened. For me, if this was real and it happened to me, I couldn't disprove anything and has vastly changed the way I look at any form of religion or spiritual beliefs. Through friends and a few events, I know a fair number of indigenous groups and older members that I felt believed enough of the old ways to tell this story. All three elders essentially said the same thing, along the very blunt line of, "Yep, that sounds like a skinwalker," and a few shared similar encounters that other friends and family have had. Only within the last, I think, 2 years, I talked to a few more people about it, and one friend finally recommended that I Google what a skinwalker sounded like. I finally looked online and heard some very similar sounds that sent the same "it's watching" chills down my spine and felt that, on top of everything else, was enough confirmation for me. To this day, now I have started my own spiritual path with respect to the lands, and especially now being on Turtle Island that I walk on. In addition to the classic "don't whistle or say its name at night," I've made it very clear to my close friends who have all heard the story and respectfully know me as the outdoorsy camping friend, that if I ever feel anything similar to being watched or that we shouldn't be in these woods, to get the fuck out with me. So this is my story of what I believe was my encounter with the skinwalker. I thought it would be good to share this on the sub. If you have any questions, please let me know and I'll answer them on the best I can. I've also attached backup links and additional interview link to someone project on Lob's Bush made about 10 years ago too. For context, the teacher was also named Lob. It's about as common as the last name Smith where I'm from.
I killed something that night. Submitted by Johann66.
I'm a long-haul truck driver. I've been doing it for almost 15 years and have honestly enjoyed it. I've hauled everything from dried goods like cereal and macaroni to things like cell phones and computers, It's been a pretty well-paying career and I've honestly enjoyed it. However, there was this one night around 10 years ago. I was hauling office supplies such as pens and paper halfway across the country. I'd been driving for a pretty long time, but I had a deadline to beat. I remember it was getting pretty late, but my favorite podcast was keeping me company. I guess listening to guys argue about sports may be a little less lonesome. The road got that way sometimes. Luckily, I had a beautiful fiancée waiting for me at home, but on that night, she would be the furthest thing from my mind. I remember cruising down a dark and desolate highway. Things like stores and houses were nowhere in sight. In moments like this, it felt as if I were the only person in the entire world. Although I was about to be proven very wrong, within my view the road was clear and empty. Suddenly, something darted in front of my truck from out of nowhere. Of course, with such a big machine, I wasn't able to simply slam on the brakes and stop. To my shock, I ended up hitting whatever ran out in front of me. It must have been big, as the entire 18-wheeler shook upon collision. I came to a stop as quick as I could, fearing the worst had happened, that the person most likely made the mistake of stepping in front of my rig. As I killed the engine, I took a minute before exiting the vehicle. After all, if I did hit someone, my life was going to be over. Getting married, having a few kids and watching them grow, those things wouldn't happen with me sitting in a prison cell. But regardless, I had to check on who or whatever this was. Though I had my doubts, they survived a head-on collision with a mighty semi. Within my first few steps, I heard a small squelch sound. Upon looking down, I saw a pool of blood already starting to form. Not to mention the fact that my size 10 boot was already standing in it. That's when it hit me. This had to be a human. No animal would lose this amount of blood. It was hard to fathom, but I was positive I had just killed someone. Within a few steps, however, I would be proven wrong. Pinned under the front of my truck was not the body of a human being. Instead, it looked to be some sort of creature. Upon further investigation, I could clearly see that it was dead. As for what it was, I couldn't tell you. The thing was a beast. It had to be around 6 foot tall, seemingly a canine-like creature with fangs protruding from its mouth. It could have been a large dog, but that didn't seem right. Even though it was stuck, I could clearly see its broad chest and shoulders, as well as 2 long and hairy legs, almost like a man's. The only thing I could compare it to would be that of a werewolf. Absolutely stumped and unsure of what to do, I called the police. While waiting around, I couldn't help but stare at this odd being. I'd never seen anything like it before, and now even a putrid smell emanated from its corpse, like that of an animal that had never bathed before. I'd be so glad when officers finally did arrive. Maybe they could make some sense of the situation. I'd be soon to be greeted by 2 older men giving me annoyed looks. I'm sure they had a long day and didn't care about some dead animal. But those thoughts would change as soon as they saw this thing. Both men's eyes grew wide and their skin pale. I heard one ask the other if this could be some guy in a costume. I watched as they tried to pull it out from under my truck. As they did, the smell from earlier became even worse. Though seeing that thing's entire body for the first time left us in awe. It was so big, the arms alone were thicker than some bodybuilders, as well as sharp claws that I was sure could rip us apart with ease. I'll never forget how the one man looked as he spoke into his walkie-talkie. He then approached me and shook his head before speaking. "Mister, we don't know what you hit, but we're gonna need somebody smarter than us to figure it out. Mind waiting by the car?" he asked. Now, I did have a load to deliver, but it seemed best to comply. If I was being honest, it would be nice to figure out what was lying there. After another 20 minutes passed, a second vehicle arrived on the scene. Instead of your usual police cruiser, I saw a mysterious all-black car. A man would step out wearing a sharp black suit to match. He looked down at the creature for only a brief moment before letting a loud sigh. Without saying a word, he began to approach me. I'd be lying if I said the man wasn't intimidating. Something about the look in his eyes. It was cold and calculating, like he walked through hell and came back unscathed. I remember he looked at me and spoke in a deep voice. "They've got a lot of cleanup to do here. Let's go to the station and talk about what you saw." Once again, I didn't resist. I willingly went along with this strange man. He drove me to a nearby police station where I was seated in an interrogation room. I was alone at first, but soon the man would return with 2 cups of coffee. He looked down while stirring his java and began talking. He told me that what I saw tonight was nothing more than an exotic pet, an endangered one that was actually very legal to own. I couldn't help but giggle. I didn't believe what he said for a second. I told him that was a stretch, that it looked more like a werewolf to me. He wasn't amused that he slammed his hand on the table and shouted. He told me that there was no such thing as a werewolf, that I needed to realize that it wasn't a game. He pushed how this was an illegal pet and wanted me to agree with him. It was to the point that he said I could lose my job if I didn't comply. Without much of a choice, I assured him that what I hit was only a pet. Afterwards, he asked me for my shoes and even gave me a pat down. It was all so strange. I didn't understand why he was being such a jerk. In fact, I felt downright threatened by him. After a few minutes, he brought me a pair of cheap jailhouse shoes. He told me mine were ruined by the blood and that he threw them out. I was pretty upset, as those were an expensive pair of work boots, but it was pretty obvious he had no room to negotiate. He didn't let me finish my shipment either, saying my truck was totaled out. I knew this was a lie. The front end was only lightly damaged. I ended up receiving a bus ticket and went back home. I was off the road for 2 weeks without hearing a thing. Finally, my boss would call me and put me back to work. Weeks turned into months, then years. My fiancée and I got married and even had a little boy. I continued to drive 18-wheelers, never having another incident like that again. My life was mostly normal, but sometimes weird things would happen. I'd receive phone calls in the middle of the night asking if I had seen anything strange. I would say no and try to identify the caller, but they always hung up. At times I would catch suspicious black vehicles following my rig while I was driving. Perhaps it was all just a coincidence, and I prayed it was. Even so, I didn't believe what I hit that night was just a pet. As for its true identity, I'm sure it would forever remain a secret. If I'm being honest, maybe that was for the best.
My Skinwalker story. Submitted by SadAd2051.
Before I begin, I would like to say this is a very long story. It's been something that's haunted me since I was 6 years old, since my first encounter with it. I have had dreams about this, and 2 very specific encounters with the creature. I'm sharing this story so I could possibly find help on what to do or how to get rid of this creature that's been haunting me since I can remember. Just for background, I'm a 21-year-old female and still worry about this creature fighting me, but I'll get in detail why later. For now, here's my story. I would always go camping with my grandparents, who I call my Gammy and Gampy, at the end of my school years. I would always look forward to it since I grew up loving the outdoors and the woods. I especially loved camping, loving the idea of having s'mores, taking long hikes, being around the campfire, and of course the wildlife we would see. Now I grew up in California, mostly near cities, so the forest was like my true home to me. I always preferred being near trees and dirt rather than buildings and crowded places. Besides, the woods were much quieter and more peaceful. I always felt safe when I was there, like nothing could ever hurt me. But something strange would always happen at the end of the month of May. I would have this reoccurring dream during the last week of my school year. I would be in the woods, walking alone down a dirt trail. The woods were always strangely quiet. I would continue to walk this path until I saw this red fox poke its head from behind a tree. Its eyes were always strangely human-like, but they were yellow and somehow looked like teddy bear eyes, and it would just stare at me. It wouldn't make a sound at all, it would just watch me. Usually in my dream I would go up and pet it, that making the fox finally make a noise, usually a soft growl. Then I would continue walking, and it would follow me. The first time I would have this dream was when I was actually around 5 years old, and it lasted until I was about maybe 11. Over the years, it would be the exact same thing. I would walk in the woods, find this fox, pet it, then continue my hike with it along beside me. But about having this dream for the 4th time, it would start to walk behind me. That's when I started to feel uneasy about this fox. I could hear it making odd noises, but every time I went back to look, it was just walking like nothing was wrong, even somehow giving me a smile. Sorry to go on about a dream, but I now believe that this was a warning of the creature. Now that the dream is out of the way, I can talk about my first true encounter. I was 6 years old and was going on a camping trip with my Gammy and Gampy for about a week. Of course, I was very excited for it, being able to barely keep myself in my school seat for the last day of kindergarten. They had picked me up right as the bell had rung and already had a camping trailer attached to Gampy's truck. I remember he drove an old red truck that only had 3 seats, me always being in the middle. It took about 2 hours to get there and another good hour to find our usual camping spot. It was deep in the woods and far from other people, as my gammy wasn't too fond of being around other people while we camped. As they were setting up the camping trailer, I wandered out the campsite, loving to dig in the dirt for bugs. I had sat down on the dirt and started to dig, but I noticed how strangely quiet the woods were. It was never quiet, not even in the dead of night. I thought it was odd, but being only 6, I didn't think too hard about it. As I continued to dig for bugs, however, I heard my gammy call for me. She would usually call me Sugar Booger, that being a nickname she gave me since I was born. That's what I had heard, but it sounded like she was very far away and somewhat sick. Sugar Booger. I looked up where I heard it come from, that being from the woods, but there was no way she was there because she was still unloading stuff from the truck. Even at the age of 6, it didn't feel right, so I walked closer to my grandparents and stayed next to them. I soon forgot about my weird encounter though, as we began to have fun. For the rest of the day, we played card games, sat next to a campfire as we ate dinner, and stared into the stars. I always loved seeing the stars, there never being anywhere I lived at. We started to get sleepy around 9 p.m., I believe, and we started to get ready for bed. There were bunk beds that me and Gammy would sleep on, keeping our luggage on the top bunk, and we would sleep on the bottom bunk. Due to my Gampy snoring, he would sleep on the couch of the trailer. I always sleep next to a trailer window just in case I couldn't sleep and wanted to look outside. I fell asleep pretty quickly though, that being last day of school and all, it was pretty exhausting. I remember waking up maybe hours or later, it still being pitch black outside. It wasn't weird for me to wake up late in the night since I always have had sleeping issues. I rolled onto my side trying to fall back asleep until I heard Sugar Booger. My eyes immediately shot open as I heard my nickname being spoken. But I knew it wasn't either of my grandparents. They were both asleep, and never were known to sleep talk before. I started to feel this horrible feeling in my gut, like whatever I was hearing wanted to really hurt me. Even at the age of 6, I knew this wasn't normal. Then I started hearing tapping around the trailer window. It was soft, but loud enough for me to hear it. Tap, tap, tap. I just sat there, frozen in fear. I was trying to just brush it off as a tree branches or rain, but I just knew that wasn't it. I could tell that it was really someone, or something, tapping on the window. Then I decided to be brave and look. Big mistake. I pulled the curtain away to only peek, and all I saw were these large yellow eyes. They seemed glassy, yet not entirely real. They looked like giant teddy bear eyes, but cold and unwelcoming. I remember in that moment I panicked and quickly closed the curtain back up. I then hid under the blanket, that being the only thing I knew to do when I saw a monster. I could feel tears falling down my face. I had never been so terrified in my life. I just curled up into my granny's side and clung to her all night long, that damn tapping only getting louder and more persistent throughout the night. I don't remember falling asleep, but somehow I did. I do remember my Gampy waking me up around noon, saying how if I got quick enough we would still go fishing. I honestly didn't want to leave the trailer at all, terrified that whatever I saw that night before would be out there. I did eventually go outside, but I was constantly looking around, horrified that whatever saw me last night would get me. My Gammy immediately knew I was scared and pulled me into a hug when she saw me, asking what was wrong. I did tell her what I saw and heard, and surprisingly she believed me. The next thing I knew, she was telling my Gampy that we were moving campsites. It took a bit to convince him, but he did eventually start to pack up and hook the trailer onto his truck. I was put into the truck so I could properly sleep, but I just couldn't. I kept feeling that I was being watched, thinking that every little noise but the thing I saw, that if I closed my eyes even for a second, it would get me. My Gammy wasn't too far from me when I heard it again, but this time it was my actual name, Aleya. In that moment, I had never seen my Gammy move so fast. She looked up into the bushes where we heard it, then to me. She then got in the truck and pulled me into a tight protective hug. I began to cry all over again, telling her how I wanted to just go back home. That's when my Gampy got into the truck as well, and since I was sobbing so hard to the point I was coughing, he agreed we could go home. We started to head out of the campsite, still heard that this trip had been ruined by something, but I still didn't know what. That's when something in my head told me to look back. I slowly did so, feeling an ice-cold fear wash over me as I saw something. A red fox, sitting in the middle of the campsite, sitting there with large yellow eyes. The same red fox from my dream, somehow curling its lips into an eerie smile. After that encounter, we never did go back to the campsite. We did continue to camp, but in more populated areas. I didn't tell my grandma what I saw, but she had told me to trust my gut. She knew that I was sensitive to certain entities, and that would help me if I trusted it. Now, this would be the end of the story, but I'm afraid it isn't. There was one more encounter I had with the creature, and it was much more terrifying than the first time. The second encounter was when I was 17, many years later. By this time, I knew very well what a Skinwalker was now, and I was still very paranoid every time I went near wooded areas. I still worried about seeing that fox, but I never really thought about it too much. Me and my two younger siblings were staying at a relative's house for Christmas, them living way up into a mountain area. I think they were my great aunt and uncle, but I'm not sure. Where they lived, there was no service at all, so unless we hooked up onto their Wi-Fi, we had no phones. I didn't mind the house, still loving the woods no matter what happened. Although at night I hated how they didn't close the window curtains, making it easy to anything outside to see inside. But I did feel safe while inside the house, knowing that they wouldn't let anything hurt us kids. Luckily, it didn't snow where they lived, so we could go outside and run around. They also had this beautiful black lab being about a year old named Pam. She was very playful and normally wouldn't listen to anyone but my uncle, although she was easily excitable. She was a good puppy. One of those days we were there, my little sister and our aunt went out to the store for a nice girls' day. Although I'm a girl, I wanted to go hiking with my uncle and my little brother. We left pretty early since the hike we were doing was 4 hours of walking into town. It was a really chilly morning, but since we were doing so much walking, it felt great. We also decided to take Pam, it being a good way for her to get exercise and have fun. About maybe an hour into our walk, I started to slow down a bit, wanting to enjoy the beautiful forest. It was so peaceful I could have honestly stayed there, but as we continued to walk, I started to feel something odd. I noticed how quiet the forest had suddenly become, hearing only our footsteps and my brother talking to our uncle. Pam noticed it too, her ears going straight up and growling softly. I started to pick up my pace to get next to my brother, worried that possibly a coyote or mountain lion was nearby. I knew though that they wouldn't be out at this time though, even if they were, they didn't walk near the roads. My little brother was only 9 at the time, and being the oldest sibling, my natural instincts to protect him kicked in. My uncle noticed the silence as well, telling us to stay close to him and Pam, who was now next to me and still growling. I began to feel that horrible feeling again, that ice-cold fear I once felt when I was 6. I tried so hard to not think of the creature, but it was all I could worry about. I was scared. I felt like I was back to being that scared little 6-year-old girl again. I had to stop for a moment though, seeing my shoelace came undone. I quickly kneeled down to tie it back up, trying to hurry just to get out of there. That's when I heard it. Aleya. In that moment, my heart dropped into my stomach. My eyes were widened and I could just feel myself start to shake from fear. It was right next to me. I heard it as clear as day. I slowly turned my head, and there it was. That same red fox, still having those horrid yellow eyes, and that same demented smile. Only this time I saw it much more clearly, its fur looking so matted and disgusting. The smell it had was like rotten, decaying flesh mixed with garbage. Its limbs were much too long for a normal fox, the back legs bending completely the wrong way. Those eyes were still the worst thing about it, but now they looked emptier than I had remembered. I wanted to scream, to run, to cry, but I just couldn't. I was frozen as I was, too scared to even blink. Then I heard it speak again. This time, however, it had mimicked my little brother's voice. Found you. Before anything else could happen, Pam suddenly jumped in front of me and started to bark like mad, snapping and growling so aggressively that it scared me out of my frozen trance. When I looked back, it was gone. I used that moment to run over to my brother and uncle, who didn't see what I saw as they were too far ahead now. But I heard my uncle start to pray and sing a song under his breath, keeping my brother and myself close to him. I was just too scared to even look back, so I kept my eyes on the ground and refused to stop walking. Pam had stopped barking, but she was still loudly growling and never left my side as we continued our hike. My little brother was a bit worried, but he just thought it was a coyote. When we finally made it into town, my uncle called around and told her to pick us up, saying something about how it wasn't safe for us to walk back. Thankfully she did come and get us, but she was confused since we talked about that hike for days. On the car ride back, Pam never left me alone. She was right with me the entire time. She knew that thing was after me and she protected me. I was very grateful that she was with us. Who knows what would have happened if she wasn't. When we got back to the house, I was talked to by my uncle and aunt. Once I told them what happened and what I saw, they had started to pray and check that all the locks were shut tight. My aunt putting something around the doors. I now believe it was probably ashes, but I never did find out. Unfortunately, this made our Christmas vacation cut short as they were worried that I was not safe while still in the woods. We had to be taken home the next day, them making an excuse of how there was an emergency with a friend and they had to help them out. I felt horrible that this Christmas was ruined, but once I did leave the woods, I truly felt safe again. Before they had to drive back home though, they told me that it wasn't my fault and that luckily it didn't hurt me or the other kids. It did make me feel a bit better, but it still brought up a lot of questions and worries. It was still around. How? Why? What did it want with me? Does it want my skin? My soul? Was I just going to be tormented by this thing forever? I still don't have the answers to these questions, and that's what really scares me. Now, I've long moved from California and now live in Kentucky. I do live in the woods, but so far, that thing hasn't found me. Now, it seems very stupid on my part, but life had changed a lot when I was growing up. I was given no other option to live somewhere else, and my grandpa in KY was kind enough to let me live with him. So please don't call me an idiot for moving to the woods when I had no other choice. Anyways, while I'm happy it hasn't found me, I'm still worried. Can it still find me? Is it still hunting me? I'm not close to anyone who knows truly how to get rid of this thing, and that's why I'm telling my story now, so I can possibly find help. So please, if there's anyone out there who does know, help me.
Forest Encounter. Submitted by Maximum Ad 8752.
I've never told anyone this story because I thought no one would believe me. But after seeing the Fears to Fathom games, I feel compelled to share my experience so others can know the truth. This is the story of the time I encountered a Wendigo in Beaver Mines, Alberta. It was the summer of 2018 when my friends, Tim, Caleb, and I decided to go on a camping trip. We were in the 10th grade, looking for an adventure before school started again. Beaver Mines, with its dense forest and serene lakes, seemed like the perfect spot. We packed our gear, grabbed some snacks, and headed out for what was supposed to be a week-long trip, excited to spend some time away from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. The first day was perfect. We set up our tent, roasted marshmallows over the campfire, and shared ghost stories. The stars were bright, and the air was cool and crisp. We felt like we were the only people in the world. That night, as we were drifting off to sleep, I heard something moving outside our tent. It was a soft rustling, like leaves being disturbed. I brushed it off as an animal, but Tim and Caleb heard it too. We decided to investigate, thinking it might be a deer or a raccoon. As we shone our flashlights into the trees, we saw a pair of glowing eyes staring back at us from the darkness. They were unnaturally high off the ground, and the figure they belonged to was tall and gaunt. The creature didn't move, it just stood there watching us. We backed away slowly and retreated to our tent, trying to convince ourselves that it was just our imagination. But deep down, we knew something was wrong. The next day, we tried to enjoy our trip, but the memory of those eyes lingered. We decided to go for a hike to clear our minds. As we were walking through the forest, we stumbled upon a gruesome scene. A deer carcass lay on the ground, its body torn apart as if by some massive, savage creature. The air was thick, with the smell of blood and decay. We heard the noise and looked up to see the same creature from the previous night, hunched over another deer, devouring it with feral intensity. Its skin was stretched tight over its bones, and its eyes were hollow, filled with an insatiable hunger. We froze in terror, watching it as it tore into the deer's flesh. When it looked up and saw us, it let out a bone-chilling scream, a sound that echoed through the forest and sent shivers down our spines. We ran back to our campsite, our hearts pounding in our chests. We knew we had to leave, but the sun was setting and we didn't want to risk getting lost in the dark. That evening, as we sat around the campfire, trying to regain some sense of normalcy, we heard the sound of branches snapping in the distance. I stood up, shining my flashlight towards the noise. We saw the Wendigo again, its skeletal frame partially hidden behind a tree. It was closer this time, and it seemed to be observing us with a sinister intelligence. We decided to sleep in shifts, with one of us always keeping watch. During Caleb's watch, I was jolted awake by his frantic whispering. It's getting closer, he said, his voice trembling. The Wendigo was now just a few feet from our campsite, its eyes glowing in the darkness. We could hear its ragged breathing and the crunch of leaves under its feet as it circled our tent. On the third night, we decided to go for a hike, hoping to clear our minds and escape the oppressive fear. The forest was eerily quiet, and we tried to ignore the unsettling feeling that we were being watched. As we rounded the bend in the trail, the Wendigo emerged from the darkness, its grotesque form towering over us. It let out a guttural roar that reverberated through the trees, and we took off running. We sprinted down the trail, our breath coming in ragged gasps. The Wendigo's footsteps pounded behind us, growing louder and more menacing with each passing second. Desperate to escape, we veered off the trail and hid in the dense bush, hoping the thick foliage would conceal us. The Wendigo's growls were now close, and we could hear it crashing through the undergrowth, searching for us. When it seemed like it was getting too close, we made a quick decision to hide in the nearest porta-potties we could find, hoping they would offer some protection. We squeezed into cramped spaces, trying to stay as silent as possible. The creature's heavy breathing and scratching noises outside were nearly unbearable. After what felt like hours, the Wendigo sounds faded away, and we cautiously emerged from our hiding spots. We were shaken, but we knew we couldn't stay another night. That night we huddled together in the tent, too scared to sleep. We heard footsteps circling our campsite, and the creature's low, guttural growls filled the air. At one point we saw its shadow pass by the tent, its elongated limbs casting eerie shapes onto the fabric. In the dead of night, I woke up to find the tent's entrance partially unzipped. Peering out, I saw the Wendigo standing at the edge of our campsite, watching us with those haunting eyes. It was as if it was waiting for the perfect moment to strike. We stayed awake until dawn, clutching our makeshift weapons, but the Wendigo never attacked. It was toying with us, feeding off our fear. As soon as the first light of day broke through the trees, we packed up our gear and bolted for the parking lot. We didn't speak, we just moved as fast as we could, our instincts screaming at us to get away. When we reached the parking lot, we threw our stuff into the car and jumped in, our hearts racing. Just as we were about to drive away, I looked out the window and saw the Wendigo standing at the edge of the lot, its eyes locked onto mine. It didn't move, but its presence was a terrifying reminder of what we had experienced. We sped away, leaving beaver mines and the Wendigo behind. Since that trip, I've never gone camping again. The memory of the Wendigo haunts me, a constant reminder of the terror we faced. What was supposed to be a week-long trip ended abruptly after just 4 days. I hope that by sharing this story, others will be aware of the dangers that lurk in the shadows, waiting to prey on the unsuspecting. So yeah guys, hope you enjoyed today's stories. If you did, leave a like, maybe even subscribe to show your support. And by the way, if you have an interesting story like this, make sure to leave it down in the comments, and if it's interesting enough, I'll even feature it in a future video. So have a good one. Peace.